A 1,300-year-old Eucharistic bread has been discovered. In fact, not just one of these, but about 5 of them. This is an incredible archaeological discovery, and it gives us insights into what early Christian communities, especially in where it was discovered, Turkey, what early Christians in this region believed about the Eucharist. So we're going to take a look at that coming up next on the Michael Lofton Show. So I love anything archaeology related, but especially whenever it touches on biblical archaeology or Christian archaeology. I love it. So anything related to that, I'm all over it. In fact, I have to say, I do have a little bit of maybe a modest archaeology collection myself. Obviously, I'm an amateur, but it's something that is definitely of interest to me. So this one caught my attention as soon as I saw it. It really did raise an eyebrow. Take a look at this fascinating discovery that was just made. And by the way, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this. I would greatly appreciate your support. 1,300-year-old possible communion loaf bearing an image of Christ is found in Turkey. And it's more than just one of them. And we're going to see some pictures of them. In fact, let's do that first. Take a look at that. 1,300 years old. So about 700 AD. Look at this. This is the site in which it was found in. Take a look at another one here. You can clearly see crosses on it. Look at this one. Clearly is an icon here of Jesus, and I believe he's supposed to be holding a gospel. So let's take a look at the story. A team of archaeologists have discovered at a site in southern Turkey 5 small round loaves. It's interesting that it's 5 loaves, right? Probably intended for the Eucharist. Not probably, certainly. More than 1,300 years old, one of which features an image of Jesus Christ. The discovery took place in Topraktepe, an ancient Roman and Byzantine center known as Irenopolis, the city of peace, located in present-day Karaman province in the historical region of Anatolia. The loaves, made with barley and dating from the 6th to 8th centuries, have been exceptionally well preserved thanks to their carbonization and the oxygen-free environment where they were found. According to researchers, they are the best preserved examples of their type found in Anatolia. And as I'm reading this to y'all live, I think I may have requested to participate in that archaeological dig. Let me look through my email real quick. This is so embarrassing. I should have checked that out, but I'm just now realizing it. Hold on. Is this the same one? Okay, no, I don't think it is. Never mind. Because, yes, I did request to participate in some archaeological digs. And so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But no, this one wasn't in. I think I'm confusing it with a different one in Turkey. But okay, the loaves made with barley and dating from the 6th to 8th century. So somewhere in there, right? So it might be a little bit older than 1,300 years old. They've been exceptionally well preserved thanks to their carbonization and oxygen-free environment where they were found. I mean, I'll say, look at that. Very well preserved. I mean, gosh. Can't get any better than that. According to researchers, they are the best preserved examples of their type found to date in Anatolia. One of the loaves depicts the figure of Jesus Christ, accompanied by the Greek inscription, "With our gratitude to the blessed Jesus." Gratitude. I wonder if that's kind of related to the Thanksgiving, which is what Eucharist stands for, right? With our gratitude to the blessed Jesus. Other features feature reliefs in the shape of a Greek cross, which I showed to you over here. You can see it on that one. think that's probably what they're referencing. According to the official statement from the Karaman government, the figure depicted corresponds to Jesus the sower or Jesus the farmer, a different image from the traditional Christ, Pantocrator, and that's Greek for ruler of all, a very common icon that you will find in Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches, depicted in a majestic pose, holding the gospel in one hand and the other raised in a gesture of blessing. So you can kind of make that out right here, right? You can kind of see that there, right? There's a face, here's the body, legs, and here's one of the arms that you can see. Maybe a little bit better in this one. Scrolling down a little bit, Giovanni Calamati, a professor of history at CEU, San Pablo University in Madrid, Spain, who specializes in the Middle Ages, explained in conversation with ACI Prensa, CNA's Spanish language news partner, the significance of this discovery, pointing out that the iconography of Christ changes over time. By this time, the 700s, you start to actually have a debate on the issue of iconography. I mean, the history of iconography is something we've talked about in great detail already on this channel, but definitely in this time period, there's a big debate on them, and you have some councils that claim to be ecumenical, opposing icons, and then other councils backed by the emperor and then later the pope, and therefore ecumenical, approving of icons. And so this is that time period where you have a lot of disputes on the question of iconography. Calamati emphasized that the discovery took place in a city that was not important within the empire, such as Constantinople, so it may provide clues to a historically unknown form of liturgical worship of Christ, a much more local liturgical worship that originates from people who do not belong to the elite, but is a devotion much more of the common people. The excavations were carried out under the direction of the Karaman Museum and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Experts will continue analyzing the loaves to further their study and gain more insight into their origin and use. And I want to talk a little bit briefly about this because, you kind of have to ask a question. All right, what were they doing here? What were the circumstances of them being discovered in this context? Was the building destroyed and then caved in and therefore well preserved? Why were the loaves here and not consumed? Are these reserved? Is this part of the reserved sacrament which was taking place and still takes place in the East to this day, although in somewhat of a different form? Or were these not necessarily confected prosphora breads? In other words, the bread that's going to later on be confected to the Eucharist, but it wasn't yet consecrated and confected and therefore isn't technically the Eucharist yet, and maybe something happened to them. Maybe they all had to run away from some invader army and they ended up leaving them there. I don't know what the circumstances are, but it does kind of raise the question, why were they there and were these confected? And if they were confected, this would be a news item of its own, because if these truly are, Eucharistic prosphora bread, right? If they're confected, this would be the oldest, to my knowledge, instance of the Eucharist that has survived unto the present. I don't know of any Eucharists that have been preserved for 1,300 years. But hey, I'm no absolute expert here. Maybe there's something out there, right? But I've never heard of the Eucharist being preserved for that long, right? But then again, these could be prosphora bread that wasn't yet confected. So let's maybe talk a little bit about those practices. And you'll notice this is leavened bread, right? But this is leavened bread in that Turkey area. What we do know about how the Eucharist was done in this time period. So if we're talking the 700s, early 700s, we know that in the West, in the Latin churches, the Eucharist was still being done with leavened bread. So these large leavened pieces of loaves of bread. They weren't using the communion wafers used in the Latin West today. That didn't really get introduced into the West until about a century later. So a century after this time period. So late 8th century, early 9th century, then you start to see an introduction of, the unleavened communion wafers introduced into the Latin Rite, and not universally at this time period. It took a long time for the Latin West to kind of universally adopt the flat unleavened communion wafers. So it's not unusual to see this either in the West or in Turkey, right? Because that would be a little bit more considered the East. And of course, the East has always maintained that practice of leavened bread. And they maintain that unto this day. In fact, I've baked some of this prosphora bread before. I'll actually show you this isn't my image, but this is the same one that I've used when baking prosphora bread that was used in various liturgies. This is the seal or stamp that you use whenever you're making the leavened bread, and then you stamp it on there right after it comes out, right before you put it in the oven, and then you bake it. So this is what's used today, and you can kind of see they were using some kind of seal or something like that even back then, because to make something like that, you have to have a seal, right? So they were definitely using that at that time period, and that's still being used today in Eastern liturgical practices, whether we're talking about Eastern Orthodoxy or Eastern Catholicism, or even Oriental Orthodoxy. I've been to some Coptic liturgies where they have similar things like that. And so the East has always kind of preserved that tradition. The West had this tradition, but then deviated from it for a number of reasons, along with a lot of other liturgical innovations in the Latin Rite, for sometimes very good reasons. But this is one of those things that began to change in the Latin West about a century after these would have been discovered. So we know that they were doing this in this time period, certainly in that region. By the way, to substantiate the claim about, leavened, unleavened bread, here's something from a Latin priest, professor of theology in the Latin Rite. The bread for the Eucharist has been unleavened since the 8th century, really the end of the 8th century, early 9th century. That is, it is baked of flour and water without yeast. At the Last Supper, Christ probably took this kind of bread, which was interpreted in the Passover memorial as bread of affliction, the bread of nomadic shepherds who had no homeland of their own. There's a huge debate on what kind of bread was used at the Last Supper. During the first millennium of the church history, however, it was the general custom in both East and West to use normal daily bread, that is leavened bread, for the Eucharist. The Eastern churches still use it and usually have strict prohibitions against the use of unleavened bread or azymes. The Latin Church, for its part, regards the question as of little importance, since at the Council of Florence, that's the reunion council between East and West that was very short-lived, and we've spoken about numerous times and have many lectures on in my magisterium courses. You want to check those out, go to rtcourses.com and take advantage of the discount that's available on my magisterium bundle there. But we've talked a lot about the Council of Florence because it's really important to East and West relations, and it's one of those ecumenical councils for Catholics, not for Eastern Orthodox, however. The difference in custom was simply acknowledged and accepted. So the Council of Florence basically said you can have it either way. So here is, I think this is a quote from Jungmann. In the West, various ordinances appeared from the 9th century on, all demanding the exclusive use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist. That's when we start to see it changing in the Latin Rite. A growing solicitude for the Blessed Sacrament and a desire to employ only the best and whitest bread, along with various scriptural considerations, all favored this development. Still, the new custom did not come into exclusive vogue until the middle of the 11th century. So you still have, even by the time of the middle 11th century, the use of leavened bread in particular churches in the Latin Rite. Particularly in Rome, it was not universally accepted till after the general, they say, infiltration of various usages from the north. In the Orient, there were few objections to this usage during olden times, not till the discussions that led to the schism of 1054, which I talk about in my book, Answering Orthodoxy, is not a real date for the schism, right? I think most of us know that, right? It wasn't until 1054 did it become one of the chief objections against the Latins, which is fun, right? Because it's a fun point to consider. You know, during the 1054 issue, they weren't debating necessarily the papacy. Or even front and center the filioque. Like those things were there, but it wasn't the big front and center issue. The big front and center issue was azymes and the question of leavened and unleavened bread, and things like, can priests have beards or not? Some pretty wild stuff. You could see some petty grievances in the Byzantine lists, as they're called. Those were the points of contention at the time, oddly enough, not so much the dogmatic issues that we consider points of contention today. But be that as it may, at the Council of Florence, however, it was definitely established, it says, that the sacrament could be confected in azymes without the fermentation of bread, it says there in Latin. Therefore, as we well know, the various groups of Orientals who are united with Rome continue to use the type of bread traditional among them. Okay, so another point to consider, not just the type of bread being used here, that's not a surprise, but the question is, again, whether or not this was confected. Or was it just, bread that they were going to use for the Eucharist, but they never got around to it? Something happened. I don't know if we can answer that conclusively, right? You can't put it under a microscope and determine the answer to that question. And unless there were something to indicate, that this was part of the reserved sacrament, I don't know if we could have an idea. But the question is, did they have a reserved sacrament in Turkey in this time period, 1,300 years ago? Of course, most viewers here should be familiar with the practice of the reserved sacrament, right? So you have the Eucharist that's distributed during the liturgy, but you also have some portions of the Eucharist that are confected during the Mass are then reserved in a tabernacle at the end of the liturgy. And that may be used for a later liturgy that's celebrated, or it's used to give to the sick who are not able to attend the liturgy, and maybe the priest or someone will go and distribute it to them. That's a very old practice, the idea of reserving the sacrament, and very well familiar with that in the Latin Rite. The question is, does the East have that practice? Well, actually, yes. The Eastern churches, Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, do reserve the sacrament. Now, they don't tend to have, any kind of veneration of the reserved sacrament, like Eucharistic adoration in the West. You don't tend to find that practice in the East. But you do have a reserved sacrament. And so there is usually a tabernacle somewhere in Eastern churches, again, whether Eastern Orthodox or Eastern Catholic, there's a tabernacle, and it preserves some small square pieces that are dried pieces of the Eucharist. And before they're dried out, what they do is they take the confected bread that becomes the Eucharist, dip it in the confected wine, which is also, right, the Eucharist. So dip it in there and then dry it out. So then you have communion under both kinds. And then you take it and you put it um, in the tabernacle once it's been dried out, and it will last there a long time, right? So you might have it in there all year. And then the Eastern churches, what they'll do is once a year, they'll swap them out, for new reserved sacraments, right? But those aren't reused during another liturgy. They just stay there to offer that to somebody who's sick and not able to attend the liturgy. That's the purpose of the reserved sacrament. So that's a practice that you'll find in the Eastern tradition to this day. Now, the question is, did they have that at this time, 1,300 years ago? Most certainly they did. Most certainly. The idea of a reserved sacrament is pretty old, right? I mean, we can find some 4th century sources that talk about this in that region. And so that tells us, even well before these loaves were discovered, I'm sorry, well before the loaves were made, you already had that practice. They were reserving the sacrament. I just pull up something real quick for you here from Basil, who's, kind of in that region, right? But there's a plethora of more. It was clearly also permitted to Christians, especially in times of persecution, to keep the Blessed Sacrament in their own possession at home, that they might receive it privately. And then they're citing Basil, who refers to this. Although Basil mentions cases where this is done even outside of period in times of persecution. So yes, you did have a case where the Eucharist was reserved during times of persecution in a layman's home, and then the layman would go and usually on a daily basis take the Eucharist and self-communicate. That was very common during times of persecution. But what we know from the historical record is that was also a common practice outside of times of persecution. It was very common for laity to have the Eucharist at home and then self-communicate without a priest being there to give it to them. And of course, they were using their hands when they did that, right? So there's some interesting applications there for some of the discussions today. Be that as it may, you can see they're reserving the sacrament in that practice, right? And Basil, in fact, even refers to in his own day how they would tend to reserve the sacrament in like a golden dove, which interestingly enough, you can find in many sanctuaries today. And that's the tabernacle for a lot of Eastern sanctuaries. It's a golden dove, usually hanging from the ceiling above the altar table. And so if you've ever noticed that there's something hanging above the altar table and it doesn't look like a lamp, that's what it is. It's actually the tabernacle in the Eastern tradition that reserves the sacrament. Okay, so we know that they were doing that at this time, right? 100% hands down for sure they were doing that. But then the question is, is that what this was? Was this something that, they preserved intact, like whole loaves here? You'll notice they didn't have it like cut up into small pieces as they have it today. If this is the reserved sacrament, if it is confected, a confected Eucharistic bread, they didn't cut it up into pieces, right? This is clearly intact. So might that be evidence that this wasn't confected? I don't know. Might we be reading that practice of cutting it up into small pieces like that, reading it back into this time period? I don't know. Those are questions that I have, and I would love to find some answers from maybe archaeologists in this time period. I'll perhaps reach out to the team that engaged in this archaeological discovery and see if I can get some answers from them. Who knows? Maybe they're willing to come on the show and talk about it. But for me, it's unclear as to whether this prosphora bread here, which is clearly intended for the Eucharist, it's unclear to me whether or not it actually is Eucharist or whether it was bread that was going to be used for it, but something happened. Soldiers came in, took over something. I don't know. I have no idea what the circumstances behind this archaeological dig and location really are. But it is a fascinating case nonetheless, for sure. One way or another, this is absolutely fascinating. But if this is confected, then you have to ask the question, is it still the Eucharist after 1,300 years of this kind of preservation? Usually theologians would answer that by saying, well, it would still remain the Eucharist as long as the accidents haven't changed. So it would still be the Eucharist in that case, unless there's a massive corruption in the accidents. For example, when the accidents like break down beyond the accidents of bread into, more basic elements in your digestive system, at that point, it's no longer the Eucharist, right? So at least that's my understanding of how it works. And so I don't know, is it still the accidents of bread, or is it maybe so fossilized it's not that anymore? I don't know. It would be a fascinating discussion to hear theologians and others who are, experts in that area discuss. And so there's a lot of questions still surrounding it. Nonetheless, this is absolutely fascinating to see. And hopefully we'll find many, many more archaeological digs like this in the future. I want to remind y'all, in 1 week, I'm going to be delivering a lecture on understanding papal infallibility, its nature, history, and challenges. Go ahead and sign up for your spot at rtcourses.com. Sign up and get your seat so that you can have a spot and ask questions live at the end of the lecture. Although if you cannot attend live, this is October 25th at 12 p.m. Central on a Saturday. If you cannot attend live, that's fine. Once you purchase access to the course, you'll always have the lectures. And after you purchase it, at the early bird discount right now, you'll get an additional discount on my Magisterium Studies program, 30% off of it. So take advantage of it. 1 week left. So go to rtcourses.com and get that so that you can get the really good discount here on the Magisterium Studies bundle that will teach you everything you need to know about Catholic teaching authority, how to read magisterial documents, what exactly the magisterium it is, what its history is, what are the ecumenical councils in the church. Like we talked about the Council of Florence earlier, we have a whole lecture devoted to that. So go and check it out. I think you'll really, really enjoy it and benefit from it. Okay, everybody, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless.